The Ford Model T was not the first production car, but you could argue it was the production car, the one that changed everything. It wasn't just a revolution in the automotive world, it was a revelation. It changed both the way cars were made, together with the fact that it changed society. It put America and truly the world on wheels. Hi there, Rick DeBrule here at the Martin Auto Museum with another collector car profile. The Martin Auto Museum, an amazing collection of cars here in Phoenix, more than 170, spanning the full automotive spectrum. I mean, everything from stuff like a Model T up to a mid-engine exotic Corvette. So if you're into cars, this is a place you'd absolutely want to come and spend some time at. Henry Ford's concept for the Model T was pretty simple. He wanted a car that was going to be reliable, easy to work on, it had to be relatively easy to drive, and it had to be affordable. And there's no question that when it came to the Model T, this car delivered on all four of those. It truly was a huge success for Henry Ford and the Ford Motor Company. But it's important to point out that there were some failures that came before this one. I mean, to start with, Henry Ford's first car company, well, it went bankrupt in just 18 months. His second car company, which was actually called the Henry Ford Company, well, it was around for a few years, but it was eventually, well, he ran into a problem with his investors. They bought him out. And interestingly enough, that car company is still around today. You know it as Cadillac. Henry Ford, of course, was long gone by the time it became successful. He then formed the Ford Motor Company. Now, this is the Model T. It was actually the 21st car that he came up with, obviously starting at A, working his way to T. However, of those cars, only about 8 or so made their way into production. When the Model T came out, there was the Model R and Model S that were still being sold, but the Model T was so successful that soon they got rid of the R and the S, and all they had was the Model T. How successful was the Model T? Well, when it first came out in 1908, sales immediately began to crank up to the point that their most successful year, they sold more than 2 million of these. Before it was all over, they sold more than 15 million Model Ts, not just in America, but around the world. Various versions of them. You could get a pickup, you could get what's called a depot hack, what we think of as a station wagon today. They had enclosed versions, they had roadsters like this one. He truly designed this so it could be a car for just about everyone and just about every purpose. And once again, it was so successful in its day. At one point, they were producing more cars than all of the other car makers combined. Well, not only was the car innovative, but so was the way they built this car. You know, when they first started producing the Model T, they were doing it on sort of an assembly line, and it was taking more than 12 hours to produce each car. As time went along, they decided there had to be a better way. Now, Henry Ford did not invent the production line. That had happened earlier, but he was definitely the guy, together with his company and his engineers, who perfected it. That first car, those first cars that they built, the Model Ts, that took more than 12 and a half hours to build, as they worked through the process, first off, they were using interchangeable parts, which made it easier to put the parts on and off. They were very consistent in the way they were creating and building them. And then the way they moved the cars through the factory improved over time. They took that car that was taking 12 and a half hours to build, and they got it down to just over 90 minutes. Think about that. From 12 and a half hours to a car that was being built in over 90 minutes. Now, not surprisingly, that was massively going to increase their profits. But that wasn't Henry Ford's singular goal. Well, let me rephrase that. That was his singular goal, but he also wanted, let's say, world domination when it came to his cars. So while most cars were used to, when they come out, and over time they slowly but surely increase in price, when they came out with the Model T, the original price was about $850. That's what Ford says. That's what I'll go with because I've seen various numbers out there. But let's say it's $850 when they first come out with the first Model T back in 1908. Over time, as they began to reduce the amount of time as they're producing the car, so now it's just 90 minutes, they've reduced their labor costs significantly. Ford not only is making more money, but he also reduces the price of the car. They go from being $850 at one point down to just $290. I think that was back in 1924. And once again, if his goal was world domination, he was achieving it because more and more people could afford his car. As they produced more and more people bought them, and the world domination, having cars all over the world and indeed all over America, was truly successful. And there's another interesting thing that Henry Ford did, and there are various stories as to why he did this. But he created the $5 a day working wage. Now, his argument was that he said that he wanted his workers to be able to buy the cars that they were creating. There's another argument that says he was simply trying to prevent other car companies from poaching his workers that he had worked so hard on training. Of course, he could have achieved that with just a slight bump, but he didn't do it with a slight bump. He almost doubled the amount of money that Ford Motor employees were making as they were building these cars. And in doing so, you could almost argue that he helped to create the middle class. Now, Henry Ford had plenty of problems. I can go into loads of details of it, but one of the things was the fact that he also was very controlling. Some of that money, it wasn't just increasing the hourly wage, it was like a bonus. And to apply for that bonus, you actually had to achieve certain sociological goals. They had people who would visit the workers' houses, make sure they were living in a nice, clean lifestyle. That didn't even get abolished until I think the early 1920s. Once again, Henry Ford's desire to control everything was so complicated. But having said that, having created that $5 a day working wage, you can absolutely argue that Henry Ford, with all his faults, definitely changed America and changed the worker's wage for generations to come. I'm sure you've heard the stories that Henry Ford said you could get your Model T in any color you wanted as long as it was black. And that turned out to be mostly true, but not completely. In fact, when they first started building the Model T, they actually had multiple colors available. You can get it in red, you can get it in blue, gray, green. Of course, at a certain point, they decided it was easier just to build them and sell them all in black. As a result, that's exactly what they had from about 1914 until I think like 1926. The only color available was black. And then at the very end of the production run, as other companies were getting more creative with their cars, coming out with more stylish, better colors, Ford then at that point decided they'd better get their act together and started allowing a few other colors. Remember, Henry Ford always thought that he knew there was a better way to create things for the motoring public. And here's a perfect example. First off, he created the concept of just having the steering wheel on the left side. Up until that point, they had it in center on the other side. From that point on, he only built them on the left side. And they were driving on the right side of the road, so it made sense. And here's an interesting thing. He also said, well, we shouldn't have a driver getting out and potentially stepping out into traffic. So you'll notice on this side of the door, this side of the car, there is no passenger door right here. It looks like there's a door. There's this little outline, but it doesn't actually work. The only door for the car was on the passenger side. To get into the car, if you wanted to drive it, you had to get in on the passenger side, slide over, and then get behind the wheel. Once again, he was convinced that drivers didn't need a door. It's kind of like saying, oh, drivers don't need a cup holder for their coffee. I don't think they need to get in on this side. It was much better if they got on the other side. Once again, Henry Ford had a habit of wanting to control every aspect of what was going on in his world. Now, eventually they did create the second door on this side, but for the longest time, if you wanted it, well, you got it in black, and you only got one door, and that was on the passenger side. All Model Ts had a 4-cylinder engine. It was 177 cubic inches, that's 2.9 liters, which really, when you think about it, is pretty large for a 4-cylinder motor by today's standards. It had this really interesting removable head. It was creative for its time. Ford came up with that. Spark plugs across the top. What it didn't have was a battery. That's right. If you were going to start this, you needed that hand crank up front. And then what would happen was at the back of the engine, where there's a magneto system, as it began to spin, it would actually create the electricity that would provide the spark for those spark plugs. One other thing it didn't have was a fuel pump. The fuel was actually gravity fed to the carburetor right here. The fuel tank is underneath the driver's seat. As the fuel would come down, it would get pulled up into here and eventually get sent up to the various cylinders and work that way. Pretty creative way of solving that problem. Another interesting aspect was the fact that the fuel itself, well, it was designed to run on both kerosene, ethanol, and gasoline. And that's because, well, back then they didn't have a consistent way of getting gasoline to every place. Some people needed to use whatever they had, which might have been kerosene or ethanol, basically alcohol. So as a result, that's what they were using back in those days. This engine, once again, it only created 42 miles an hour on a 20 horsepower motor. Not exactly powerful, but once again, that's all you needed for this particular time. One of my favorite aspects of the Model T is the design of the suspension. You have to remember, back then, they didn't have great roads. I mean, not just great roads. The roads were horrible back then. They were ruts. There weren't a lot of paved roads. So as a result, this car had to be capable of going just about any place. And the simple design that they came up with for the front suspension and the rear suspension was actually amazingly creative. First off, they had this big axle across that was made of vanadium steel, which was an alloy that was both light and strong. Now you'll notice we've got some jack stands holding it up now just so it doesn't all compress, but this was a great way of being able to have something that was strong and yet capable of flexing. Across the top is something called a semi-elliptical spring. You'll notice it's actually a series of metal bands that are put together, and what it does is it flexes like this as it's going across there. And it's called transverse mounted, meaning it goes from side to side rather than from front to back. As time went along, cars became, well, they continued using these elliptical springs for a long time, but they were front to back. They would be mounted onto some portion of the suspension, or pardon me, of the chassis. Here it's just mounted on one place, right on the very bottom underneath here. And there are actually a couple places where the front axle is going back and mounting just ahead of the transmission. And the beauty of this suspension is that it made it so it was very flexible. These front axles could actually tilt radically. And the reason being is you never knew where you were going to be going. There's a lot of great old film showing Model Ts going up and down all kinds of terrain because the axle could flex a massive amount, even more so than a lot of modern Jeeps can today. So it was beautiful the way they designed this. And the rear suspension actually works the same way. So nice and simple. They use this for an awful long time. And the other important aspect about this is you look right here, look at the ground clearance that you've got from ground up to that axle. Remember, they were going over really bad roads that had a lot of rocks, all kinds of things that might be in the way. So having a lot of ground clearance and a front and rear axle that could radically move in terms of its angle made this suspension truly innovative. Driving a Model T might look straightforward. I mean, after all, there's a steering wheel, there's pedals on the floor, but the reality is it is not simple for you and me who are used to driving modern cars. That's because, to start with, there is no gas pedal down there, no throttle on the floor like we're used to. The throttle is on the side of the steering wheel. That's this little device right here. On the other side, well, that was the advance for the Spark. So what do the pedals do? Well, the pedal on the right, that is the brake. The pedal in the middle, that's for engaging the reverse gear. The pedal on the left, well, that's for the forward drive gears. Push it all the way down, that's your first gear. Halfway up is the clutch. All the way out, well, that's your second gear, the gear you would drive around town in. So if you were driving this, well, it took a little bit getting used to because you had to, once again, it was a hand crank up front. Then you had to figure out how to start and drive. As you got used to it, it got easier because, once again, that was Henry Ford's goal, to make sure that everybody could drive these things. But it absolutely took a little getting used to. And by the way, the brakes work differently than you're used to. For example, you're used to the fact that you've got maybe a disc brake on each corner, on each wheel, slowing each wheel down. When you step on the brake on this car, what you actually do is you have a band that closes in on the transmission and slows the transmission down. On each corner, there are no brakes. You're actually slowing down the drive mechanism when you push down on that brake. Now, it was relatively effective. You've got to remember, they weren't going that fast back in those days, so it wasn't that hard to slow down. But having said that, if you're used to a modern car, it is absolutely something you would find completely unusual for this. Well, Henry Ford truly understood exactly what the automotive buying public wanted back in 1908. As time went along, he began to lose touch with it. Now, once again, Henry Ford always wanted to dominate. He always felt he knew what was right, both for his workers, for the public, for everybody. But there was a point in time when he began to lose that touch as other car companies came along with cars that were more comfortable, more powerful, more stylish. Henry Ford didn't want to do that. He said that this was the only car that the American public needed. They didn't need any more than a Model T. But guess what? Those other car companies were slowly but surely beginning to get market share, take away from the Model T. The Model T, almost to the end, was still selling in big numbers. But as the automotive public was buying more and more cars, they were beginning to gravitate to more stylish cars in other areas. As a result, eventually, well, they had to see the fact that things had to change. Now, Henry Ford was opposed to it almost to the very end, but eventually they brought the production of the Model T to a close. Now, when they did that, interestingly enough, they actually had to shut down production when they stopped producing the Model T for 6 months, laid off all their workers to gear up to building the next model, which was the Model A, which of course, it only ran for a few years, but was a very successful, very innovative car for Ford for a long time. So in a way, the Model T, which was the car that created and allowed the Ford company to become a behemoth, was almost the ruin of the company at the same time, because Henry Ford stuck to it for so long, refusing to make the changes, until fortunately Before it was too late, they changed, went to the Model A. But the Model T absolutely made its stamp on the American public, on the worldwide automotive world, selling around 15 million of these, putting everyone around the world into a car.